We all know the telephone game. Whether you call it telephone, Chinese whispers, pass the message, grapevine, it's the same kids game where you pass the message down the line and see if it gets to the end intact. It's pretty good for teaching English to kids and beginners, but did you know there's an advanced version, which is even more fun? I'm Will from Enchanted ESL, and in this video I'm going to introduce you to narrative telephone. I'll explain what it is, how to play, and how to adjust it to the needs of your students. So we all know how telephone works. One player starts by whispering a message to the next player, who whispers that message to the following player, and so on until it gets to the end of the line and you see how much it has morphed. But a few years ago, when the world was stuck in lockdown, the folks over at Critical Role released a series of YouTube videos called Narrative Telephone. It was fantastic. It works just like telephone, but instead of saying a sentence to each other, they told a whole story. They did this by recording themselves telling a story and then sending that on to the next player, who listened and then recounted the story. The results were hilarious. I recommend you check out the first one, which I've put up there and down in the description. Anyway, all this got me thinking, could I use this game in the ESL classroom? The answer was yes, but we do need a few alterations. First, I'll explain how to play the spoken version of the game, and then later I'll talk about a written variation. You're going to need at least 4 players. That can include you, the teacher. But if you're teaching a single student or a pair, then I'm afraid this game won't work for you. The ideal number of players is between 5 and 7. If you have more than that, you can split them up into groups and play simultaneously. Definitely don't want to play with more than 8, otherwise it'll get too unwieldy. Alright, so you need to establish an order. Who is player 1, who is player 2, who is player 3, etc. Player 1 comes up with a story. They can spend some time on this and may write it down if they wish. Depending on the level of the students, I recommend the story should be between 50 and 100 words. Advanced students may be able to handle more, but I wouldn't aim for the kind of thing in the Critical Role series, that will just be too much. Player 1 now meets with player 2 in a private place where nobody else can hear them. Player 1 reads the story to player 2, who has to listen very carefully. Because now, player 2 is going to meet with player 3 in that private place and is going to recount the story. Player 3 then does the same to player 4, and so on until you get through all the players. The last player then tells the story to everybody in the group, and you get to see what has stayed the same and what has changed dramatically. Now, you may be thinking that this game isn't very well designed, because most of the time a lot of students are sitting around doing nothing. And that is correct, but we can change it in 2 different ways. First, we can have multiple stories going on at the same time. For this, you really need an even number of players, either 4, 6 or 8. Now it's not just player 1 who comes up with a story, but all of the odd numbered players. So also player 3, player 5 and player 7. When they've made their stories, player 1 tells their story to player 2, player 3 tells their story to player 4, player 5 to player 6 and player 7 to player 8, and so on. Now all of those stories go along the chain with the last player looping back to talk to player 1. This adds an extra layer of chaos and challenge, as the stories will get muddled up along the way. The other way to play is with a homework activity. For this, students must be able to contact each other with audio messages. Pretty much all messaging apps these days have this feature. In the time between classes, player 1 thinks of a story, then records themselves telling it and sends it to player 2. Now player 2 listens and then records themselves telling the story again and sends it to player 3, and so on. When you get back to class, the last player can reveal the final version of the story and you can laugh at the results. Be careful, because playing this way requires a level of trust and maturity. First, it's really easy to cheat, and second, it requires everybody to be engaged. If one person in the middle of the chain doesn't take part, then it never gets to the end. But with the right group, it can work a treat. As you can imagine, narrative telephone is a super fun way of practicing communication skills. If you're thinking of using it in your class, hit the like button to let me know. It also helps the channel grow, so much appreciated. If you want, you can adapt narrative telephone to a reading and writing activity. It plays in a very similar way, but with all of the stories on paper. Player 1 writes the story on a piece of paper and then passes it to player 2. Player 2 has some time to read the story and try to memorize the details, then turns it over and without looking, writes the story again. And then they pass it on to player 3 and so on. To keep everybody active in this game, everybody can start with the story and then pass it on. So if you have a group of 6, there can be 6 stories going around. The amount of time you let your students read the stories they're given depends on the length of the stories and their level. I aim for about 1 to 2 minutes. And of course you can set the written version as homework just like you did the spoken version. In both variations, the content of the stories is important. You can get students to apply language they've recently learned in class, or include certain vocab categories. But where possible, let them use their imaginations. And they should include unique details to make their stories shine. However, don't let them write just long lists of words, otherwise it'll just become a pointless memorization exercise. Pro tip, if you listen in to your students telling the stories or collect the written forms, you can assess their performance without them even realizing. Some students will take to the game straight away. Others will be more hesitant. The big challenge is knowing what to do if you can't remember part of the story. So while the game does improve focused listening skills, don't punish them for making mistakes. After all, the whole fun of the game comes from all the changes people make when they get it wrong. So encourage students to improvise and fill in the gaps when they can't remember something. But that doesn't mean students can just ignore the original story and come up with whatever they like. They should have the maturity to try to do their best, but when they can't manage it, they have some creative freedom. It can also be tempting to do a long dissection of where all the changes happened and who messed up and where, but I would avoid this. You could do this if you have loads of time, but I think your time is better spent elsewhere. Briefly look at the most dramatic changes and then move on. It's not a competition and there's no prizes for getting the right story at the end. It's just a bit of fun practice. With the right group, narrative telephone can be a regular classic in your classroom. So try it out and let me know how it went down in the comments. And if you're not sure it will work with your students, there's always an alternative. One of my favourites is Say Anything. It's a fantastic game for provoking debate and discussion, and you can learn how to play in this video here. But for now, I've been Will from Enchanted ESL, wishing you all the joy and success in your teaching. See ya!